Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's a beautiful outside, a beautiful day outside. And very appropriately, we're moving from the horrors of subjugation to the seeds, the very, very beginning of Geulah, of coming out of Egypt. Now, until we actually march of Egypt, we have almost a year of learning. But and the poor subjects of our study, the Israelites, have quite a lot of suffering and difficulties to still go through. But it's a truth of life and also a truth of Tanakh that things rarely happen just like out of the blue. There's a very, very careful buildup, not only of the possibility of liberation. It's not just negotiating with Paro, etc., but also of making the people ready for that moment, ready to grasp that moment. And as we discussed last week, part of this readiness is not just about regaining what they lost. Just to sum up what we talked about last week at length. Oh, can you hear me okay? Okay, so just to sum up what we talked about at length last week. So to regain names, to regain language, to regain agency, to regain freedom. It's also about gaining the ability to form an alternative to the Egyptian way of life. That was the point we finished with last week. The point of the story is not just to get the Jews out of Egypt and into a place of identity and freedom, but also to a place where what they form, the system they become, doesn't become another iteration on the same old world, so to speak, but rather a city upon a hill in the true sense of the word, in the sense of something new and different. And before we start seeing these little seeds of change that take place in the text we're going to read this today, I want to revisit a little bit what is the Egyptian way of life, because we focused a lot last week on our experience as a nation in Egypt, right? What it was like for us. But we were not the only ones suffering in Egypt. Egypt was not just how it treated the Jews, the Israelites. I'm sorry. When I say Jews, I mean Israelites. At this point, there's no Jews as such. The whole system was meant to keep everyone down. There's a famous midrashic interpretation of the phrase "sus v'rochvo rama bayam" from Shirat Hayam, when it says, the horse and the rider drowns in the sea, that this is a hint to the system of life in Egypt, that in Egypt, everybody was either under someone or over someone or both. Everything was arranged under lines of control. So I want to read two sources about it in the first box in the source sheet, which I hope you have in front of you. Do you have the source sheets? Yeah. Okay. I think there might be some outside. There's some here. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. And okay, so please pass them on. Thank you. In the source sheet, I'd like to read two perspectives on what it meant to be part of the Egyptian system. One coming from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, and one from scholar Yoram Chazoni, who's not coming from within the Torah community, but provides fascinating insights into both the story aspects of Tanakh and the philosophy that underlies it. Let's start with Rabbi Sachs. To the extent that the Torah is a deliberately contrarian work, a protest against and conscious alternative to the great civilizations of its day, it is worth reflecting more fully on who Ramses was and what he represented. Rabbi Sachs accepts the theory that our Paro, the evil Paro that we're talking about, is Ramses III, whom we actually know from history, and what he represented. No one in history constructed more monuments to his glory than Ramses III. Mistake here. It is clear that when Paro responds angrily to Moses' request in God's name to let the Israelites go, saying, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let the Israelites go? I do not know the Lord." What he means is, here, I am God. And we know that, right? We know that they had a whole culture of deifying the king, that the king is above mere mortals. And the process of deifying, making the king into a god involved these major monuments, these building projects, this accumulation of wealth and concentration of wealth in the hand of the royal dynasty. At the same time, the normal people in Egypt didn't live much better than the Israelites do in Shemot. It's not that the Israelites were suffering and the normal Egyptians were celebrating. As Rabbi Sachs says in the next quote, the wealth of the royal court was astonishing. At the same time, the population as a whole lived a wretched experience. We know from archaeological digs that people lived in very, very basic conditions. We know from the analysis of bones that were found from that era in Egypt that people were ridiculously malnourished and that there were constant plagues and diseases. It's a common factor in human history that people who live near rivers are exposed to a lot of plagues and diseases. Not plagues as in locusts necessarily, or as in arov, some wild animals coming and eating, but bacteria and viruses. And people died very young. The life expectancy was 30, 40, something very, very low. So Rabbi Sachs focuses on the contrast. He focuses on the contrast between the king up there and everybody else down here. It's not even sus v'rochmo, man and his horse and his rider, in the sense of like a gradual hierarchy, every person is above someone else. It's really the king and a small elite and everybody else is dirt on the earth. Yoram Chazoni focuses on something a little different. He's not just focusing on the external conditions of living under an oppressive regime of the Egyptian variety. He's focusing on the state of mind it creates in people. And this is going to be what we focus on today, the state of mind and what it takes to outlive this state of mind, to outgrow this state of mind. So I'm reading here in the second source. Actually, before I'm reading, I'm going to explain something. Yoram Chazoni describes in detail this process where I think we mentioned it a little bit last week, these empires that are built on grain in the rivers, near big rivers in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. So people live off the land, grow grain. Then a king comes and says, I'll protect you from people coming and taking this grain from you. Have you ever seen the movie Seven Samurais? Has anyone here seen it? It's a Japanese classic, and it describes basically this reality of these dirt poor peasants working their fields. And every year, without fail, when it's time for harvest, these bandits come. The bandits have a great way of life. They don't need to do all the work. They're not like the ants who have to work and work and work and work. They just come and take everything that somebody else makes. And the people of the town, the people of the village in the movie, look for someone to protect them. According to Chazoni and a certain school of historians, this was the beginning of the early states, exactly this moment where the peasants are desperate for someone to protect them. And then someone comes, a warlord, a king of some sort, makes himself their monarch. But slowly what happens is that the monarch starts pushing them to produce surplus so he can accumulate it by taxing them, so he can create wealth. And then it becomes a cycle, and this cycle of king, priest, tax collector, and the dirt poor peasants were forced to remain on the land, not to rise off it, as part of fears that the Jews will do, as we mentioned last week, and to work the land for the king, for the benefit of those who want the surplus. They still have the same low level of sustenance that they would have had they done it themselves. Just a second. But the wealth is funneled up to the king, kind of like Rabbi Sachs is describing here. That's what Rabbi Sachs is relying on, that description of history. What Yoram Chazoni wants to show is that this cycle warps the mind. Because what happens is that more and more, in order to keep people working, the kings, the elites, the nobles, depending on which society we're talking about historically, feed down this lie, this great and shining lie that says, it's good that you work for the good of the state. It's good that you do what the king tells you, because the state is crucial for our survival. Otherwise, all these horrible bandits, all these roaming Pirates out there will come and take everything, take your children, rape your daughters. So everything you do that's for the good of the state is also for your good. And it creates this warping of the mind, both on the individual level, where people can't bring themselves to question the system they live within, and on a group level, where right and wrong start to be defined by serves the state as decreed by the king, as the king defines what's good for the state, or hurts the state. I can tell you from my family experience, my parents grew up in the Soviet Union, that this was very much a lie that was reinforced over and over again, both through punishment. Anyone who says something against the state, which is defined broadly to include all the people representing the state, the leaders of the Communist Party, right? Anybody who says anything against them is traitor, is, harms us. It's this histrionic response that starts from the top, from punishments meted out, but is then reinforced by the sus v'rochvo, by the leaders at every capacity going down the chain of command, basically gathering the people under their power and making them repeat it. Taking a person who's asking for a visa to Israel and forcing him to sit there while all his co-workers make these rote declarations about how it's a betrayal and how dare you and you're betraying the paradise of the workers. And then the people who are responsible for the building he lives in, and I'm talking from my father's experience here, gathering all his neighbors to do the same thing, just deliver these condemnations that everybody has to deliver, otherwise they will also be seen as traitors to the state. And what we see today is not that different from the way machinery of state worked in the ancient times. You wanted to ask something or comment?
Were the Israelites the only people who were enslaved by Pharaoh at this time?
No, it's a good question. So the Israelites were not at all the only ones that were enslaved. I think what's unique about them is that they're ethnically diverse, divergent from the main population. But at the same time, there are other groups of slaves. The pyramids, all these great monuments were not built with mostly free labor. And it could be argued, and to an extent, this is what both Rabbi Sachs and Yoram Chazoni are saying, that everybody was enslaved. All the normal people who are not part of the ruling elite, they don't really have a choice. If they don't do their work, if they don't follow orders, if they don't, for example, send their sons for certain times of the year to work in the building projects, give some of their food, some of their workforce, some of their time to whatever the king decrees, they would be killed. And somebody else would be given their land to work under the same conditions. Yes.
Wasn't it in the shop that when Yosef was running things, once people ran out of money to buy the food, they had to give their land. So they became landless, basically slaves, because they had no way of earning any real money. But I think the difference was that the Jews, the children, the babies, boys were killed. That was, I think, more of the big difference.
So just to repeat the question, it's a great question. That wasn't in the pshat that Yosef arranged for it. That Yosef, at the end of the book of Genesis, when people ran out of food, basically forced them to sell their land, to become landless workers, become serfs for the king, to use a later European term. And yes, according to the biblical narrative, Yosef was the architect of this process that in many ways made the Egyptians almost slaves. And there's this great, I don't know whether to call it historical justice or historical irony, but definitely something in the fact that then in the next story unit, it's us, it's Yosef's descendants who become enslaved, who lose some of their agency. If some of the traditional commentators hadn't made exactly that point, I would feel more cautious about saying that. But I've seen Midrashim make basically that claim that when Yosef made the country more efficient at the cost of the people, he created the tools of subjugation of his own people later, because this is the trade-off. The trade-off is you serve the state, you make the machinery of the state more efficient without changing the morals of the state. You're unleashing a beast. You're unleashing a danger. We'll get to the babies in a little bit. Let's read Yoram Chazoni now. Thus, in the ethics of the ancient Near East, all action was ultimately directed towards the maintenance of the state, since all goodness was seen as flowing from it. Indeed, whatever served to maintain the closed circle of, farmer, tax collector, king, soldier, and priest was on its face for the good, since it kept the clockwork of the state in motion for another day and another generation, maintaining the mass of people alive and protected. The biblical narrative, from the moment Abraham is told to leave Ur Kasdim, is trying to form an alternative to this way of life. It's trying to teach us that no, right and wrong are not defined by what's good for the state now, today, not by what the king tells you is right or wrong today. There are absolute, universal good and evil decreed by God, and we have to be willing to leave everything behind, to leave civilization behind, like Abraham did when he left Ur Kasdim behind, and become nomadic if that liberates us to follow God's definition of right and wrong. But what we will see today, as we start to look for those seeds of redemption within the horror that is this Egypt, is that even in this horror, people, without leaving everything like Abraham, without following God's words, just out of their own conscience, out of their own feelings, are able to find the crack, to crack this picture of the world where good and evil are defined by what's good or bad for the state, as the king says, or by the king's decree, and see that there are good and bad beyond that, that there's some Archimedean point outside of the state that defines what to do. And the first moment we see it is the moment when Paro tells the Israelite midwife, tells the midwife to kill the boys. Let's look in the second box. The king, ויאמר מלך מצרים למילדות העבריות, אשר שם האחת שפרה ושם השנית פועה. Note that there are named. They're the first characters here, other than Paro, who have names. ויאמר, בילדכן את העבריות, as you deliver the babies of the Israelite women, the Hebrew women, וראיתן על האובניים, אם בנו, ועמיתן אותו, ואם בתי, וחיה. I want to point out that the phrasing here is interesting. He doesn't just say, kill the boys, let the girls live. He says, when you see, look, if it's a boy, kill him, and if it's a girl, make her live. He is drawing attention to the act of sight, of looking and determining. And we will ask in a second why. Why is that such an important thing to emphasize here? And then the response of the midwife is in the next verse, in 17. Vatirena hameyaldot et ha'elokim. The midwives were afraid of God, feared God. Velo asu kasher diber elehen melech Mitzrayim. And they didn't do as Egyptian kings told them. Vatechayena et hayeladim. In other words, the midwives are afraid of Paro, but they have a different fear that outweighs it. Even though they're part of this closed system of the state, they're totally dependent on the king. They can be killed at any moment. Even though they're ingrained and indoctrinated in this system, they're feeling something inside their heart from within that breaks apart the shackles of the system and allows them to make a choice that goes against their self-interest, against their own survival, and puts them in great danger, but is the right choice. And this emotion is their fear of God. And now I want to ask you a question. Why do you think there's this emphasis when Paro talks to them about seeing? Just a second. Yes.
Well, the miskach milim between the word yira, a fear, and ro'eh, seeing,
It's beautiful.
yeah, I mean,
So-
it's just something, it's so evil.
So I'll repeat for our friends here on Zoom that there's this game of words. That in Hebrew, the word irah, fear, and the word lirot are very, very similar to see. So when he says you see and they fear God in the next sentence, in the next verse, it creates a certain balance. It creates a very satisfying kind of like, this is his proposition and this is their proposition. But I think there's something here deeper than the words. Yes.
When they see, they're beginning to use their independent sense of discernment. In other words, Paro just said, you know, he gave a decree with no room for discussion, and they stepped in and used their judgment. Ozakar on the Keba, and beyond that, what are they going to do? Once that door was open for discernment, they decided that it is they were going to do.
That's an
The
excellent,
beginning of agency. in a certain way.
that's an excellent way to put it. I'll just repeat it again. Basically, the emphasis here is that he tells them to see, and I'm rephrasing a little bit, he tells them to see in a very mechanistic sense, see this, do X, see this, do Y. But the second he invites them to make an act of discernment, in a sense, it opens the door, or they open the door to exercise moral discernment as well, which is a very important point. Yes.
Isn't it also the thing where Pharaoh thought he was God? And here the Yaldot are saying, no, Pharaoh thinks this, but we know another God that we think is more correct or more in charge than this Pharaoh God.
What's your name? Sorry.
Tina.
Tina is making another, I think, taking another step back and looking at their act of rebellion in a new light, in a sense that they're not just saying, we're not going to follow his orders, but by fearing God, they're already asserting on some level that Paro is not the God for them, that there is a God and it's not Paro, which is an excellent point. Yes.
I just think that it lays beautifully over Hazoni's second paragraph, where, yes, you're in the state, which has its rules, but biblical ethics demands that each person sees on his own as a nomad from outside, where do I fit into this machine?
Exactly. This is exactly, I think, how Hazoni would answer the question. And I agree that when Yoram Hazoni presents, you know, the ancient world great civilization way of life, and then we didn't read it, right? So let's read the second paragraph in Hazoni's quote. Biblical ethics proposes to evaluate human action from a completely different point of vantage, a point of vantage associated with the life of the nomad, who observes and evaluates all that goes on in human life from a perspective that is outside the political state and free of any prior commitment to it. So you can read on later, but it's a way of life that puts a lot of responsibility on the individual and on the individual's ability to evaluate, going along with what was said before, that it's an act of discernment. The lirot here, Paro perhaps didn't mean to invite them to exercise moral discernment, but he's opening the doors to them exercise their own judgment. Yes, and then we'll continue.
Any of the commentators to discuss how did they know that there was another God, that they could fear God, our God?
The question is, do the commentators discuss how they knew to fear another God? I didn't see a commentary like that. I didn't see a midrash like that. That doesn't mean it isn't out there. My own study is far from,
They
you know,
discuss
comprehensive.
that They fear God, that everybody thought Pharaoh was God. or
So-
thought that everybody.
So I do want to say that later, when Moshe comes back, because God sends him, and we're going to get to Moshe later, but when Moshe comes back to Egypt with God's mission and the people welcome him, it's clear that they have some sense of what he's talking about. They're not, the questions they ask him are not, wait, which God? Wait, which history? Which hints to us that even though they were described in the first chapter, as we discussed last week, as people who lost their names and lost language, some memory did linger. And when Moshe comes and says, God told me that he is the God of our forefathers, it means something to them. It awakens certain memories. So presumably the Me'aldot Ivriyot had some tradition, not to the extent they should have, not with safety to practice it, but they had some sense of history. However, I can look more, but I didn't see a midrash that deals with that directly. It just seems to be assumed that they know. I'll reopen the stage for more questions and comments in a minute. I just want to put us in a different context a little bit that shows this moment and its importance in a new light. You know, we're in the generations after Yosef, right? Yosef and his brothers are history at this point. In fact, we spent a lot of time in the first chapter letting go of their generation. We started with them. These are the generation these are the people who came to Egypt, and Joseph was in Egypt, and then we moved past them. But when we watch the Me'aldot here overcoming their fear, Joseph comes back into the picture, even if not directly. And in order to explain what I mean by that, I need to take another step back and talk a little bit about the way dictators and tyrants of all sorts use fear. I talked a little bit following Chazoni about the lies that dictatorships propagate. That beautiful lie of the state will protect you, the state is your ticket for survival. But of course, this lie is not just a benevolent lie, it's reinforced by punishment, by death, by being sent to the gulag, by having your children taken from you, by having your whole family erased, by having all kinds of horrible disasters at the disposal of the state at every moment to unleash upon you. And when people were talking about the Soviet Union decades before it collapsed, and many people said in the West, experts in the West, that it's collapsed, it's too powerful. What the dissidents inside said, no, it must collapse because the few can't control the many. And there was a particular thinker in Russia named Amalrik, and he used a very potent image. He said, imagine a prison guard holding a gun on a prisoner to keep him from running away. Just let's simplify the reality of dictatorship into this image. One man, and a gun. Eventually, the guard's arms are going to go tired. And he's going to have to put down the gun, even if it's for a very short amount of time. And at that moment, the prisoner will strike. Now, of course, the reality is more complicated. There's many guards and there's many guns, but there's also many more prisoners. So somewhere, someone will stop paying mind, will not notice the cracks, and the prisoners will break free, except that in dictatorships, prisoners imprison themselves. Other than few people who rebel and are sent to an actual prison, the histories of dictatorship are rife with people being too afraid to act out. In a sense, it operates on the same logic as terrorism. Terrorism, unlike open warfare, targets the few, but through the fear, the terror it creates, it controls the many, or tries. We shouldn't let it win, but it tries to control the many. Because you don't need to kill many people to create so much fear that people will start thinking seriously, what can we do to remove that, to not be afraid of that anymore, to not have that in our life anymore. So you don't need to send everybody to the gulag, but you just need to make a showcase of enough people to keep them down. And what Chazoni shows, and I'm moving to the next box, the next page in the next box, Chazoni, when he reads the story of Yosef, says that yes, Yosef is very powerful in Egypt. Yosef is the head, other than Paro, he's at the top of that chain of Susan Rochvo. But even Yosef is not immune from that fear that the power of the king exercises on people. And Chazoni reads a particular part, a part of Tanakh, it's in the bottom of box 3. It's a part of the story that happens after Yaakov dies. And Yosef wants to carry out his promise to bury his father in Canaan, right, where his fathers are buried. And instead of going to Paro and saying, I'm going on vacation, sorry, you deal with the grain for a little bit, or telling him, I have a mission to accomplish, I will be back in half a year, or any of the other statements we might expect him to say, we see the following. I'm reading in the Hebrew, you have the translation right there. It's a box 3 in the bottom. Vayavru yemei bechito, the days of wailing are gone. Vayedaber Yosef el beit Paro le'emor. Im namatzati chen be'enechem, דברו נא באוזני פרעה לאמור. So first of all, he's not talking to Paro directly. He's talking to the house of Paro, to the household people. Instead of approaching the king, whom we saw him talking to directly before, he is talking to the people of the king. Secondly, he doesn't tell them, let Paro know, right? He says, if you like me, if you see, imatzati chen, it's terminology that repeats itself a lot in Esther, exactly, in the service. If I am, appealing, pleasing to you, please talk to Paro to say the following. Avi hashbi'ani le'emor, hine anochi met, bekivri asher kariti li be'eretz Knan, shama tikbereni. He doesn't say, I want to bury my father. He says, my father made me swear. He's putting the emphasis on being committed, being torn by this commitment that he needs to carry out. Ve'ata e'elena ve'ekbera et avi ve'ashuva. Now let me go up and bury my father, and I'll come back. Vayomer Paro ale ukvor et avicha ka'asher eshbiacha. As we read, I pointed out several of the things that point out to Yosef not feeling 100% confident that he's going to get a positive answer. But I think that the very contrast between the meandering language of verses 4 and 5, where Yosef is making his request, and Paro's very abrupt answer is emphasizing this as well. Paro doesn't bother with messengers or flowery language or anything like that because he doesn't have to. He's the one in power. He says, sure, go, but do this thing that you need to do. Very briefly, very clearly. Now, what I didn't include here in the quote is that Paro didn't give unqualified permission. He made one condition. Does anybody remember what the condition was?
Wasn't leave the wives and children.
Exactly. Leave the wives and children. Does that sound familiar from Shemot later, right? That comes back. Later, that's going to be one of the first concessions Paro is going to make to Moshe. He's going to say, sure, the men should go, the women and children should stay. The first time we see it is not then. The first time is here. Already in this moment with Joseph, who is a powerful man, beloved by Paro. Powerful, beloved, and yet not fully trusted. I'm sorry?
Yeah.
In a sense, he was. Let's read how Chazoni puts it. He puts it very well. I'm going to read in the second quote. It's above here, it's still in box 3, but the second quote of the Chazoni quotes. Mighty though Joseph may be, he is not free. No longer a shepherd like his father. He is instead a servant to Paro in the house of bondage. There is no question, of course, but that this house of bondage remains one of the great political and economic powers on earth, with the ability to give life and take it away. And there is likewise no question but that a man such as Joseph necessarily feels himself free as he gives out orders to others. But compelling as this experience may be, it is an illusion. The first among slaves may be powerful, but a slave he remains, as you said, subject to annihilation by his master at a moment's notice, at Paro's house, no less than in that of Potiphar. When once he is faced with the prospect of Paro's wrath and a possible loss of favor, Joseph is struck with the self-same terror of the Hebrew slaves facing that other Paro generations later. I'm skipping to the next part of what Chazoni says, just the part in bold. The physical works of mortar and brick is really nothing more than the concrete expression of an inner enslavement. Fear is the first enslaver. And when the Me'aldot fear God more than they fear Paro, this is the enslaver they defeat. This is the tikkun they're offering. It's a tikkun, not just tikkun, correction, redemption, not just for the reality they live in, but to the slavery that crept into our DNA, into our national existence from Joseph himself, from Yosef himself. In a minute, I'll open the floor for questions and comments. I want to advance a little more first, okay? Okay, so we have a tikkun for Yosef, right? We have Yosef and we have some sort of tikkun for Yosef, but Yosef didn't get us into Egypt on his own. He had God leading the way, but more importantly, he had 11 or 10 other partners in crime in the process that ended up with us in Egypt, namely, of course, his brothers. What we will see today is that here in Egypt, in the beginning of the turning point, someone will offer a tikkun also for the brothers, for their sins that brought us into Egypt. But before we do that, we need to take the next step in the story. So we will see that in a moment, how there's a tikkun also for the brothers' mistakes. But first, let's see the next step in the story. The next step in the story, since the midwives failed to comply with Paro's desires, is that he makes that terrible order here in the top of box 4. ויצב פרעה לכל עמו לאמור, כל הבן הילוד היאורה תשליכו, וכל הבת תחיו. Every boy should be thrown into the Nile, and the daughters should be made to live. And note that here he's already not talking about discernment. Perhaps he learned a little bit from his mistake. He's not offering discernment. He just says, just kill the boys, just throw the boys into the Nile. Before we continue and see how people in the story respond to that, I want to take a moment to focus on the Nile itself. The Nile for Egypt is more than a scenic river. The Nile is the basis of the civilization we've been discussing. This is the source of all that wealth that allows it to become great and allows it to become the kind of power that warps people through beautiful lies and fear, as we discussed today. But that doesn't have to be so. You know, civilization doesn't have to be based on fear and terror. You could have wealth, but it's used well. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his work on Joseph and Moses, in a beautiful book called Vision and Leadership, talks at length about the Nile as a potential source of good. And he thinks that this question of how this source of good should be used was at the core of Paro's dream about the cows coming out of the Nile, the bad cows and the good cows, right? The good cows that come out, the beautiful cows that are then somehow devoured by the bad cows. And he reads it like this. I'm here still in box 4. Paro saw these beautiful cows devoured. The civilization of Egypt in his vision could produce wealth, plenty, pleasantness, beauty, prosperity, and security. But it also had within it satanic elements that wanted to destroy every institution to which the same Nile gave birth. Civilization, no matter how successful it is in its attempt to ease man's burden, is also capable of destroying him and everything for which he stands. The curse imposed upon Adam by the Almighty, that the environment will display hostility towards man, is a reality. It'll yield its produce to man and yet conspire to destroy him. Outwardly, the environment appears to be cooperative. Clandestinely, it is out to defeat man, to trample over him. And he elaborates, I'm skipping a little bit ahead, each discovery to the advantage of man makes the life of man more precarious than before. Pollution, malignancy, the possibility of destroying life on our globe in a few seconds. What are they, if not the 7 other cows? Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik is talking about side effects of civilization almost, or unintended consequences. And he suggests that when Joseph interprets the dream and offers to manage the situation for Paro, Joseph is trying to avoid these side effects. He is trying to, in a sense, help maintain civilization without reaching the disasters that might grow from it by sharing, by creating a world of sharing where they accumulate the wealth and then use it for the benefit of everything. But we already know that this is not exactly what happened. As was mentioned before, this beautiful vision of sharing was eventually used to enslave the population. The king didn't accumulate wealth and then share it to be a good king. He shared it with Joseph's active involvement and leadership to make people controlled, to make people lose their lands and be all the more dependent on him. So the Nile, as the basis of civilization, Joseph may have thought he can curb the bad things that come out of it But the net result is the enslavement in Egypt, of Egypt and in Egypt eventually. And when Paro tells them, take the babies, take the future, and throw them to the Nile, this image is charged with symbolism. Because if the Nile is the basis or the foundation of the Egyptian civilization, and now you color it with the blood of its future, of the babies that are born in it, you're in a sense saying in symbolic language that this civilization is based on, founded on blood, and the blood of children at that, the blood of the future. And in a sense, it's a rejection of this more benevolent interpretation of civilization as something that can go either way. And it's saying, no, this civilization as it is now can't go the good way because it's founded on blood. It doesn't have anything positive at its core anymore. What lies at its core are dead babies. And yet, despite this horror, despite this terror, the next thing we hear is about new life. I'm in box 4. Vayelech ish mibet Levi, vayikach et bat Levi, ותער האישה ותלד בן, ותראה אותו כי טוב הוא, ותצפנהו 3 ירחים. Why do you think it's important for us to hear that a man went and took a woman? I mean, we need to hear about this baby because the baby will become important. We all know, spoiler alert, everybody knows it's going to be Moses, right? But why is the wedding important? Why is the union of the parents important at this point of the story? Any thoughts, comments? Yes. And therefore?
That they're from the elite of the people.
So you're saying that they're both Levim, and we need to know that not so much because we need to know that they married each other per se. What we need to know is the yichus of Moshe, that he's coming from the elite, the priestly elite of the Jewish people. Yes.
I think that I don't sort of agree with that assumption of that fact that the Nile had all this, I know it had blood in it, but I got the impression from reading it is that the Jewish babies really didn't count. It was the Egyptian babies that counted. It was Egypt that counted, almost like in Nazi Germany or Russia. The Jews just didn't count. So what they maybe then looking back at it, we think that it's the Nile that was found in blood. But then I don't think that's how it really was. I would think the first Makkah might have been something like that. But I would definitely think that Jewish babies really didn't count.
So Arlene, right?
Or-
Or Audrey, I'm sorry. Audrey is questioning my reading here, fairly enough. No, it's a good criticism that when they throw the babies in the river, they're not throwing the future of Egypt into the river. They're throwing the Jewish human babies into the river. Namely, in a sense, what they're saying, we can reread it differently and say that the basis, the foundation of Egypt is exclusion, almost. It's those who don't matter, right? I was talking a little bit, you're right, I used a little bit of a shorthand, so thank you for calling me on it. I was talking from the perspective of Joseph.
I didn't mean to. Everyone has a different viewpoint. Yours, mine, that's what makes it so special. But that's just my view.
No, of course, I don't mean it as a confrontational, I'm sorry I used such confrontational terms. I didn't mean that like that. I think that I'll make a general comment for a second that I think learning is always collaborative. And by calling my attention to this, you're forcing me to be more exact or, rearrange what I'm thinking. So I meant it only in a positive sense. And I will use what you said in order to clarify a little bit better what I meant about the babies of the Nile and the blood. I was talking more from Joseph's perspective, meaning Joseph makes himself a servant of the Egyptian machinery of state. I mean, he puts himself at the service of this civilization when he not only interprets the dreams that Paro has, but says, I have a solution. Let's do this. And then becomes the solution, becomes he who carries out the solution. And as Rabbi Soloveitchik sees it, Joseph is doing it not just to save himself from prison. He is an idealist. He believes that this civilization can be made something beautiful, something great, and he wants to be part of it. He wants to be in a position to do it. But if he could see where it leads, if he could see that the same Nile that stars in the dreams he interprets, the same Nile that allows all this wheat to grow that he aggregates and shares on very particular terms, will then be where the babies of his people, his descendants, are thrown. From his perspective, from this perspective that kind of focuses on his contribution to the creation and maintenance and strengthening of this state machinery that is the Egyptian state, there's a certain element of you're trying to redeem the unredeemable. That's kind of, does that clarify it a bit? Yes.
And the second time when the Pharaoh tells the nurses to drown all the boys, doesn't say the Jews, it's really his own people too. He says, don't discriminate between anybody, just boys, whether they're in Rim or the Egyptians or whatever. It's a very big step across the border, the red line from Jews.
So, okay, so first of all, the question is, or the comment is that when Paro tells to kill the boys and not the girls, it sounds like he's talking to everybody. All the boys of Egypt should be killed, not just the Hebrews. And I want to address that because, first of all, he doesn't tell it to the midwives. He tells his old people. There is a midrashic kind of outlying tradition that reads it like this, that says that Paro was afraid of someone leading a rebellion against him because his chachamim told him that there's going to be a baby born, like in all these stories, right? It's a very primal type of stereotypical, like archetypical story that the baby that will ruin you is born. Like it reminds me of Harry Potter in today's parlance. That baby, he who has the power to kill you approaches. And therefore he decided to kill all the boys. Most commentators don't read it like that. And they don't read it like that for several reasons. One is because, yes, you could say here, he tells everybody to kill all the boys and let all the girls live, but it's in the context of his dealing with the Hebrews. So it should be understood that he's talking about the Hebrew babies. Another point in favor of not reading it as all the babies in Egypt, but rather only the Jews, is that later when the princess finds the baby, she says, Mi yaldei ivrimu, right? Mi yaldei ivrimu. Like she immediately assumes that a baby who is put in a, how do you say, teva? A basket? I'm sorry, when I say basket, I think of shopping. It just doesn't, the whole image doesn't compute to me, but whatever it is, on the river, she immediately assumes that it's a Hebrew child, which strengthens the assumption that those were the babies that were endangered. Like, it's weird for a mother to put her baby at the mercy of the elements in this way. So there has to be a good reason for it. And a good reason would be that Hebrew babies are endangered. I'm not saying that to reject this reading. It's a reading that exists and, of course, strengthens what I said before about the civilization of Egypt being built on the blood of its babies. But it's only one, it's one option out of several of looking at it. That's what I'm trying to explain. Yes.
And in the text, it says, "Vayomer melech Mitzrayim la'miyaldo
Mm.
Ivriach."
So to clarify, we're talking about this next stage when he tells him to throw him to the river, not that stage. And we're in box 4 on the top. After the Me'aldot don't kill the boys, Paro confronts them and says, how come you didn't do what I said? And they come up with an excuse. They said, oh, these Jewish women, they go and give birth in the field. So we don't have the opportunity to even look at the baby and to kill it or not.
I mean, Do we really see this as a change in, I mean?
Yeah.
have you seen that, it really as a change in policy?
Yeah.
All these children?
No, not the Egyptian children. That I'm saying, that is an outlying interpretation. That is a certain interpretation, but there is a change in policy in that if in the beginning, those who are supposed to carry out this genocidal act are the Hebrew midwives, once Pharaoh sees that that doesn't work, he says his own nation becomes complicit. His own nation becomes they who must carry out the this horror, this really horror thing. Let's continue. Let's talk again about the wedding. So one option that came up is that it's important for us to know that the men and the women who married and gave birth to Moshe are Levites because we need to know the yichus of Moshe. It gives us some information about the yichus of Moshe. Any other thoughts about why the wedding is important? Yes.
To know that they are Levium, because not just do they have yichus, but they're prestigious. So if the Levium are going to take a chance throughout the year, because they know they're going to have children. So they're going to get married, they're going to show everybody we're strong, we're getting married, we're going to have children, and we have a luna that this is going to be taken care of by some other kind of being that is going to save us all and save our children.
So just to reiterate, for everybody to be on the same page, you're saying that the fact they're Leviim and therefore from the priestly elite of the people, or not priestly exactly at this point, but some sort of elite at this point of the people, is important not just for Moshe. It's important because it tells us that they're modeling something for the people around them, that they are marrying as a model of, even though we're living in this horrible time, even though our babies might die, we're going to do what we need to do, and we have faith that it'll work out. That is indeed how the Midrash takes it. There's a very famous Midrash, right, about Miriam, about the Midrash says that answers the question of why we hear about this wedding, saying that because people separated from each other. It reads into this, the reality, they met, like kind of how we envision the reality, that when Pharaoh said, I'm going to kill all the babies, and now everybody, every Egyptian who sees a Jewish baby boy has to kill them, people separated from their wives. And what it took to allow more babies to be born was for one particular couple who were looked up to remarry. And our Midrash says, and this is, I love this Midrash very much, and I'll come back to it in a minute, to why I love it so much in a minute. The Midrash says that it wouldn't have come from the man, from Amram. Amram was convinced he was doing the right thing by not having babies. It was his little daughter Miriam who came to him and said, you know that what you're doing is worse than what Pharaoh is doing because he is only killing the boys and you're annihilating the possibility of girls as well. To kind of jolt him into action at this moment. And then he goes and takes the daughter of Levi, who was already his wife previously. And the significance is that they're modeling something. And I'll get to more answers in a second. I just want to put it in another light. When we talk about storytelling, right, it's almost an axiom. It's almost a premise of storytelling, definitely before the 20th century, that the happy ending is marriage and a baby. Is the couple reunited, the possibility of pregnancy or children are born. And this is not just because it's like saccharine and kind of sweet to see it happening, it's because it's an affirmation of life. A happy ending of a story has to be life affirming. In the second half of the 20th century and in our century now, stories play around with different ways of affirming life. But traditionally, this was the happy ending. What's remarkable here is that this is the beginning. This is not the ending. This marriage and the baby that's born out of it, and these two very condensed verses, is the beginning of the story that will end well, the story of the happy ending. And this is an enormously important transition because what it says is that affirmations of life are not only important as the pinnacle of an achievement. It's not that we work towards it and then we achieve it at the end after we struggle. If you don't affirm life, if you don't embrace the possibility of life, that climbing up to the pinnacle won't happen in the first place. And exactly, terror, if you allow fear and terror, I assume that's what I heard say, to just paralyze you, then life, struggle, improvement are all impossible. Yes, you wanted to say something.
Is there here in the text? I realize that Hassan says that the Levium were the elite who moved in, when they were enslaved in the same way, but is that in the text here? Because it's later on that the Levium are chosen.
So excellent question about, we keep saying the Leviim are the elite, the Leviim are the elite. Where is it in the text? I think you're right. We're reading it backwards. Chazal say that the Leviim were elite also at that time. And also Chazal say less about the Leviim, but specifically about Amram, father of Moshe, that he was an important person because he, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi. So ish, like in this sense here, that he's like ish mi beit Levi, kind of lends him importance. Kind of, it's like puts him as an important personage whose actions are worthy of noting and following. And because of that, we can assume that he was important. But you're right, that it's not mentioned directly anywhere that the Leviim are the elite until after the events that take place. You want to offer a different?
Say, from the tribe of Yosef.
Correct, yeah, that we're moving to a different.
Say, there's a new leadership coming out of the people.
So the point, you're saying that the point of mentioning the marriage and the Leviim can also be to show that the leadership of the people is now rising not from Yosef. We're moving on to the sons of Leah, to Levi. Yes.
I think the point of saying that Vayelech ish mi beit Levi and took a woman from Beit Levi is that they're beginning to remember who they were. They lost their names, they didn't have them, they lost their connections. And now the Torah is trying to tell us they're getting it back. They're knowing who they are and what their history was.
That's an excellent point, that by telling us that it's someone from Beit Levi and he's talking a daughter of Levi, we're starting to come back to our roots. They're starting to regain or express a sense or remember a sense of who they are. Note that they themselves are still nameless. And it's a very powerful statement on two levels. First of all, it's a great storytelling technique because by leaving everybody here nameless, when Moshe gets a name, it's highlighted, it's like by contrast, everybody in the story, the mother, the father, the sister, whom we will see in a second, and the daughter of Paro don't have names. And then Moshe, just a second, receives a name. And then it becomes more dramatic that the process of naming is coming back. But I think it's also a powerful statement on another level, not just on the storytelling level, namely that before people remember their private identities, they remember where they're coming from. The name of the tribe, of the forefather of the tribe, comes first. And as people reconnect to their past and assert their future, they're starting the path that will give them also their individuality. Yes. Shifra and Puah name. I know, I'm talking here from the birth of Moshe, the whole story of the birth of Moshe in particular. Shifra and Puah already started the trend of names, and then Moshe kind of clenches it. And we'll get to that in a second. Let's skip a little bit ahead. I'm turning the page to the last page. To what happens once the baby is already born. Okay, you affirmed life. You connected to your past. You modeled marriage and babies despite the terror to all your people. And then you have the baby. What do you do to protect the baby? And here comes into the story the tikkun to the sin of the brothers of Joseph. The tikkun, not just to the sins of the brother of Joseph, but to the sad and difficult history of siblinghood from Cain and Abel onwards. I'm looking at box 6, but at the second source. The first pair of brothers. One brother kills the other. And when God asks Cain, where is your brother? Cain rejects responsibility. I'm reading here. Vayomer Hashem el Cain, ei hevel achicha. Vayomer, lo yadati. Hashomer achi Elochi. What, am I my brother's keeper? Now we know he's also lying. He knows where his brother is. He killed him, right? But this rejection of responsibility, this saying, I am not my brother's keeper, echoes throughout all of Genesis. It echoes as Yaakov and Esav's struggle, and it echoes very strongly when the brothers of Joseph sell him. Later, when they are themselves in an Egyptian prison, the brothers reminisce about that moment, the moment of the sale. And they are horrified with their own apathy to their brother. I'm in the last source in box 6. Vayomru ish el achiv. Very pointed, right? They're talking to each other as brothers. Aval ashemim anachnu al achinu. We are punished, or we are guilty on account of our brother. Asher ra'inu tzarat nafsho beitchaneno elenu. We saw his suffering, the pain of his soul when he begged us. Velo shamanu, and we didn't listen. Al ken ba eleinu hatzara hazot. The word shamanu in Hebrew can mean listen, but it usually means hear, right? So they're saying we saw and we didn't hear, which is an interesting kind of sensual or sense-oriented statement, that we saw that he was suffering, but we didn't hear it. And indeed, just a moment, in the story of the Mechira, the scene where they beat up their brother, put him in the pit, and then eventually decide to sell him, his suffering is not mentioned at all. That whole story unit of the Mechira is written from their perspective, and the suffering doesn't compute into it. We don't know what Yosef is feeling. Rabbanit Aviva Zornberg reads it to say that they repressed it. A lot of who we are is determined not by what we experience, but why we don't allow ourselves to experience. So yeah, technically they see in their eyes that he's crying, but then they don't allow it purchase. They didn't just not listen. On some level, they truly didn't hear. It's not quite the same as just declaring boldly, Hashomer achi anochi, what, am I my brother's keeper? But it's a level of apathy to brotherhood that's painful for us to read and for them when they recall it later. And here in our story, we see a sister coming and asserting that yes, in her action, she is her brother's keeper, and that she wants to see and understand what he's experiencing. And this is, of course, Miriam. I'm reading the first quote in box 6. Velo yachla od hatzpino, the mother could no longer hide him once he was old enough to cry and scream. ותיקח לו תיבת גומה, ותחמרה בחמר ובזפת, ותשם בה את הילד, she put the kid in it, ותשם בסוף על שפת היאור. She placed it among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. ותתצב אחותו מרחוק, לדעה מה יעשה לו. And the sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. Here we see another tikkun. We already saw several, right? We saw seeds of breaking apart, breaking away from the control of the Egyptian system that tells you what to do and also what's right and wrong. We saw the Meyaldot breaking away from the fear that Joseph himself experienced, and now all the slaves experience, by fearing God more. We saw these parents, through their resolution to affirm life, breaking away from the apathy or the immobilization that can come from living under this oppression. And now we see Miriam caring enough about her brother, and note that she's nameless here, but we know it's Miriam from later, caring enough about her brother to put herself out there, to follow him. And later we will see that when the Egyptian princess finds him, she jumps in to offer her own mother as a nursemaid. She actively involves herself, exposing herself to potential danger. Again, she's exposing herself to this Egyptian princess, whom she has no reason to expect will be kind to her. She's the daughter of Paro, the man who made this horrible edict, because she is her brother's keeper. And now we're hitting what I think is perhaps the most remarkable moment of all. And that is a moment where not a Hebrew person, but an Egyptian person breaks apart, breaks away from what the system tells them is right and wrong. And I think it is remarkable for a very simple yet obvious reasons once we think about it. Namely that for the Hebrews, there's not much to lose. Everything is so bad that at some point you're saying, okay, I'll rebel in my own little way and I'll be killed. It's not so different from the outcome I live with anyway. It's not so far. Death is always so close that people can become immune to its fear. But if you're the princess of Egypt, you have a lot to lose. You are the one gaining from the system. You're the one at the top, or not at the top as your father is, but you're the one reaping the fruits of all this oppression. You are the one living in those beautiful projects that all the Egyptians, not just the Jews, are forced to build. You're eating well, your exposure to sickness is less, you would be healed and treated if you're exposed to sickness, your life expectancy is higher. And yet with all of these advantages and privileges, when the daughter of Paro sees a baby crying, and she recognizes him as a Hebrew, she knows he is the forbidden child that should be killed. Something in her compels her not to take the obvious path. Let's read it here in the last box. ותרד בת פרעה לרחוץ על היאור, ונערותיה הולכות על יד היאור, ותראה את התיבה בתוך הסוף, ותשלח את המטר ותיקחיה. ותפתח, and she opened it, ותראהו את הילד, she sees him, against the emphasis on sight, on discernment, והנה נער בוכה, ותחמול עליו, and she took pity on him. ותאמר מילדי העברים זה, and she said, this is from the children of the Hebrew, to make it very clear to us, reading the story thousands of years later, that she wasn't operating under a misapprehension of the situation. She knew exactly who he is. But what she feels is pity. What she feels is compassion. This is when Miriam comes in and says, should I give you a nursemaid for him? And the daughter of Pearl says, and the baby is returned to his mother for a few years. And eventually, and I'm jumping ahead to verse 10, the child grew up, his mother brings him to the daughter of Paro. He was a son to her. And here the namelessness ends. Here appears a child with a name. And the name is remarkable as well for several reasons. The first one is in the following words of this verse, Vatomer ki minamayim meshitiu. She calls him Moshe, naming him after the act of saving him. Meshitiu, limshot, is to pull out of the water, to raise from the water. In other words, she is naming him for her act of compassion. This is quite the legacy to live up to. In a sense, she's already foreshadowing that this will be a son. This will be a son. Physically, he's not her son, but the question that kind of opens up is he going to live up to the honor of being the son of this compassionate woman? Will he too be someone who, despite growing up in privilege and wealth, see the suffering of other people? Next week, we will see that the answer to that is a resounding yes. Before he becomes the messenger of God, long before that, he is a man with compassion. And this is already foreshadowed in his name. But there's other two things about his name that I think are remarkable here. One is that the Egyptian princess gives it. In other words, our big savior, the man that after whom we call the Torah, Torat Moshe, right? The savior, the leader, the visionary, the teacher. His name is not a good Jewish name. It's not a name that a good Jewish woman gave her son. It's a name that the Egyptian princess gave him. And in a sense, his name, whenever we read Torat Moshe, Divrei Moshe, Vayomer Moshe, it's every single time we see his name, it's an invitation to remember that goodness exists not just in us, that's one important thing, but also that to live up to Moshe's legacy is also to live up to the legacy of his Egyptian mother, who blinded or could be blinded by, the gilded aspects of her life, was not. And then there's another remarkable thing about his name, and that I learned from Rabbi Sachs, and has to do with the language Egyptian. Because if you think about it, there were Egyptian kings named Ramses, right? which is similar, Moshe, Masa. It's a similar root because it was actually an Egyptian word. The word I can't pronounce it, Mases, meant child. So when an Egyptian king called himself Ramses, it meant child of Ra, the high king, the high god of the Egyptian pantheon of gods, the god of the sun. And here she names the child, not Ramses, not something like godly, just child. And this is also an act of rebellion against the Egyptian system. I'm reading Rabbi Sachs here in the last source. Moshe, in the form Mose, Meses or Meses, is in effect an Egyptian word. It figures in the names of several pharaohs, most significantly Ramses himself. The word means child. Understanding this, we stand before one of the Torah's boldest and most revolutionary strokes. Years later, two men are to be involved in a monumental confrontation, Ramses and Moses. Their names tell us what it is at stake. Ramses means child of the god's sun god Ra. Ramses saw himself as a god. Moses was simply anonymously a child. It is not one man, a supreme ruler who is in the image of God, but every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. Because when Moshe stands in front of Paro, he's not just standing there to liberate his brothers, as a brother's keeper, following in the footsteps of his sister who cared for her brother. He is also standing there to offer an alternative for this civilization rooted in violence and exploitation and poverty for the masses while the rich accumulate more riches. He is offering an alternative that is based on the image of God in every man. And this is that Archimedean point that Chazoni talks about. This knowledge that every man and every woman is made in the image of God is what should determine right and wrong for humanity, not whatever the king in power is willing to either kill us or lies to us to achieve. And this is the rebellion. This is the system that from these humble little seeds is going to grow, and we're going to follow it in the next few lessons. Thank you, everyone. We have 2 more minutes if anybody wants to comment or question. Yes.
Okay, so as he was speaking, suddenly I saw a parallel with Heather giving the baby to actually the whole way that she saved her baby up must have had some plan. Her plan was exactly what happened, that Pharaoh's daughter came and raised him so that he was out of the mentality of the rest of the Jewish people, and he was able to leave. And then you have Hannah telling God, if you give me a child, the child will have a special role. And she starts him off and brings him to Eli, and she educates him annually, and she brings him his larger clothes. And so here you have these mother, son, and
so you're saying, just to repeat it, you're saying that when this mother, Yocheved, takes her child, basically hopes for a child and then takes a child and separates herself from him, and that will help him serve God, Hannah later separates herself from Shmuel by sending him to be raised and serve in the Mishkan and serve God. And I think this is a apt comparison. And in fact, try and remind me of it next week if I forget to relate to it, because next week we're going to talk a lot about Moshe's separation from his people and what it meant that he grew up apart from his people. Yes. That Paro what?
it was the house like a normal family.
It's very interesting. And the truth is that it's very hard for us to understand the situation there. The question was that Paro, it's remarkable that Paro let his daughter adopt this Hebrew child. We don't know if Paro was aware of it or not. We have no understanding exactly of the terms of the situation, because why am I bringing all these external sources to explain the mentality of Egypt? Why am I bringing Chazoni and Rabbi Sachs? Because the Tanakh gives us very little to work on, right? So we have to kind of complement it with our knowledge of the culture, which presumably at the time that the Torah was given, people were much more aware of. So, Robert Alter, the great commentator on narrative art and Tanakh, makes this point that we read Tanakh, especially Torah, but Torah is most ancient, right? We read Torah, and some things we just don't see because we don't have the set of assumptions that people had earlier in history. This is a controversial statement because it cuts straight to the argument about whether the Torah was written in the language of its people at its time or eternally with everybody in mind. But the fact is that we don't know what it means that the daughter of Pharaoh brings a new child into the household. So I can't comment on it one way or another, but it's true. It is remarkable. Yes, and then we have to round up and.
In the beginning, where Rabbi Sachs describes the culture of Egypt and everything, poor people and the level was the king.
Mhm.
But at the end of the story, when they leave, they super chush gadol. I guess we learned from our story, Choshech, they went to their neighbors and took stuff. Where did all that come from?
So we'll discuss that more at length later. It's an excellent question about the refush that they took with them, but we'll just have to reach that later in the course. Thank you, though. Yes.
It's not just that she names him after an act of compassion. His name memorializes a forbidden act. She took a baby that was supposed to be thrown into the water and she rescued him against the edict.
Thank
of the
you.
government. It's like, that's his name.
Remind me your name?
Abby.
Abby, thank you. You told me last time, but I forgot. Abby is making an excellent point that the name of Moshe is not just memorializing a word of act of compassion. It's also an act of rebellion. It's a forbidden act. It's going against her father's edict. I think it's very fitting for a religion that starts with a son ruining his father's idols, according to the Midrash, right? To then have its next great leader, the next big luminary named after an act of a daughter rebelling against her father. Thank you, ladies. Anybody from the Zoom wants to comment or ask something? Okay.
I would.
Yes.
I would. And that is the fact that they were, Levites. Later, I just wonder if it can refer back to the original Levi, because Moses later did become rather violent. Did he have blood on his hands from Levi and Shimon?
So I'm sorry, is that a question you're asking?
Yes, that is the question.
The question is why you're asking.
Yeah, was there a sort of almost fatal determinism there, that he was from the tribe of Levi? The original Levi had been very violent. Was it? That's my question.
So it's a great question. I love it because you can read it both ways. You could say Moshe, in order to be a great leader, needs to be willing to watch people suffer, right? He needs to be willing to let the Egyptian drown in the sea. So he needs to be someone violent. But if you think back to the moment when we see Levi and Shimon enact their violence, their self-proclaimed goal there is to save their sister and to avenge and save their sister. And the Mefarshim are actually kind of split on if it's a positive act or a negative act and whether Yaakov is right in condemning them or they're right to act. But the fact of the matter is that even their act of violence is a resounding answer yes to the question, are you your sister's keeper? So you could say that bringing Levi here draws attention to the violence to come and to the fact that Moshe will have to be willing to act upon it. Or it's yet another hint. What we're seeing here is brothers starting to act as such, which will become very important as the story progresses for us to emerge from Egypt. So thank you for drawing attention to this legacy that the name brings in. I have to run to my next class. You have to run. Thank you, everybody. Wonderful to see you. Looking forward to moving onwards with Moshe as he grows up.
Thank you.